Thanks. My name is Carrie Conaway, and in my day job, I'm the Associate Commissioner for Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the State Education Agency in Massachusetts. I'm here speaking on my personal time today, but I'm going to talk about some work we've done at my agency. So, the other day I was reading the paper and a stunning headline appeared before me. Research influences policy. You know, it's funny because I think people think that there's this huge divide between research and policy, which at times there can be, excuse me, but there really, at least my experience at my agency, is quite frequently research really does influence the work that we're doing. And so I want to tell a more optimistic story here about how research gets used at a state agency and what makes it most effective. So I'm going to tell that story through the story of developing our Educator evaluation system in Massachusetts. Excuse me. Which we began in 2011. We had a statewide task force that was put together by our Board of Education to develop the principles that today we're implementing in all of our districts and statewide. These 5 principles up on the board here undergird all of that work. And so this is a circumstance where you might imagine that politics would really get in the way and there'd be a lot of push and shove, but in fact we really did use quite a bit of research evidence as we were developing our programming in this area. So what I want to tell you about this, first of all, is in what areas research made the biggest difference. A huge one was simply defining evaluation as a problem that required a solution. And I think that's one of the most important things that research can do, is highlight issues that we wouldn't otherwise have been aware of. Here I'm thinking of national studies along the lines of the widget effect, and certainly the broad variety of academic research over the years that showed that teachers and educators in general were not getting very good feedback. They weren't getting much in the way of an evaluation at all, and it wasn't really driving their practice. So this is something that bubbled up to the surface and pushed our agency to work on this area. Another area was determining how to use the educator's impact on student learning in the evaluation system. So we knew that it was an important part of what we wanted to do. We knew that we needed in some way to include a measurable impact on student growth in our rating system. But the question was how? And our reading of the research evidence, looking at the many studies that have been done in this area, suggested that we're really too new at this kind of work to put a particular percentage or particular weight on that kind of stuff. We knew it mattered, but we wanted to have it be in the context of professional judgment, in the context of practice-based evidence as well. So what we ended up with is actually, in our state, you get 2 separate ratings. You get one rating of I would call it like a professional practice rating. It's essentially your exemplary, proficient, needs improvement on your professional practice. And there's a separate rating on your student impact on learning. And that could come from something like a growth measure if you happen to teach a subject or grade where we have that, or it might come from something your district has put together that's consistent statewide. So we felt like that was, given where the research evidence was, an appropriate balancing of those 2 needs. A third area was incorporating student feedback in our system. And here our commissioner was really influenced by the Measures of Effective Teaching study, or the MET study, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He was really compelled by the evidence there that suggested that student feedback was an important piece of evidence that was getting at something a little different than what both principal observation or evaluator observation and the student learning measure could get at. And so this is in our state regulations as one of the pieces of data that evaluators need to look at, and it comes straight out of research. The fourth area where it mattered was informing our ongoing implementation. We commissioned a pretty big study to evaluate our implementation and the early outcomes of our system, to help us learn along the way about how implementation was going statewide and to help us inform our work. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we structure that to make that most effective. Okay, so how did we end up in this beautiful place where research made such a difference in our work? First, the inherent nerdiness of Massachusetts. It is a nerdy state. We're very wonky. We have lots of academic institutions, lots of folks who care about research, my own commissioner first among them. I'm not sure, I think Philadelphia is a pretty smart place, so I think you could be there with the nerds with us, but other places maybe not. But that was not the only factor. You don't have to be a nerdy state to use research. The next is we really had a commitment to learn from the previous work and the ongoing work. So when we convened, for example, this task force, we gave them a huge literature review, similar size to the book you guys have, of summaries of recent research, actual individual articles, stuff that came from academic institutions, stuff that came from comprehensive centers or intermediary organizations like Chris was talking about, a big variety of research products, so that we had a common base of what the current evidence was, what the current lay of the land was. People have different perspectives on that, certainly, and we had a huge range of representation on that task force developing this policy, but at least we were speaking from the previous work. And similarly, the ongoing work, the work we've commissioned ourselves, is very important to our program staff and to our commissioner that we're learning as we're going and not just doing things. We also were fortunate that we had a question to answer whose answer was not preordained. So sometimes this happens where you're essentially told you're going to do X. And so it doesn't really matter what the research evidence is around whatever that practice is, because you're going to do X, whether you like it or not, whether the evidence suggests you should do it or not. Here, our state board set a few parameters. For example, they said, this task force, you cannot come back with a rating system that only has 2 categories. It can't just be meets expectations, doesn't meet. You got to have at least 3. We, in fact, have 4. But there was a lot of room within what the board gave them, where they could look at evidence and say, well, what does the research suggest would be the most effective way to go about this? The last point I put up here is sufficient time. And I actually put this up here because I think people actually use this as a cop-out sometimes. They say, we don't have time to look at the research. Well, policymaking is kind of slow, usually. We usually have enough time to at least do a lit review or something, find whatever research center has done a summary. So we did have sufficient time. The task force met for about 8 months, and we've had, I guess we're in our 3rd year of implementation now. So we have time to learn, but most of the time I think that's the case. That's not just this circumstance. The kinds of research that made the biggest difference, I've alluded to some of these already. Literature reviews and reports from research intermediaries that summarize lots of different findings are really, really helpful. Probably in that big book that we created, the most common source of information was things of this nature, something that was summarizing a broad field. It's just, nobody has time to read all the individual reports that go into it. It's much easier to find a source that has either a reasonably neutral perspective or a known perspective, so you know kind of where they're coming from, and use those sources of information. Large-scale national studies, things like MET, because it sets the national stage, it establishes the issue as a problem, gives us a broader perspective on how our state is similar to or different from. But I think really important is studies with results specific to our state. One of the big factors that drove the way we chose to implement our system in Massachusetts was that our Business Alliance for Education had commissioned a study looking at the Boston Public Schools specifically, showing that only about, in a 2-year period, only about half of the educators in that school district had been evaluated at all, and that about a quarter of the schools had conducted not a single evaluation during that 2-year period. And so, we knew that this was a problem generally because of previous work, but having a Massachusetts-specific example really drove the conversation in a way that just saying, well, Illinois is having a problem, or Philadelphia is having a problem, or whatever, wouldn't have done. And then finally, studies we commissioned ourselves, because we there can drive the research question, we can set the methods in a way that works well for our districts, we can focus on the areas that are most important to us. Had there been implementation studies at the point at which we were developing the policy, those would have made a big difference too, because otherwise you end up learning things the hard way. There are definitely things that if there had been prior implementation work that was relevant for us, we would have used, and it just was not at the time available to us. So looking back on all of this, I have some suggestions for the researchers in the room about how to help your work be more connected to the kind of policymaking environment that I think if you showed up for this conference, presumably you're interested in. The first is simply to know the policy and reform agenda. And I think it's great that you guys have the action plan right in your books. You'll be able to connect. Your research director's already pleading with you to please pay attention to it as you are developing your projects. And not just in a broad general way. So not just effective educators, but what are the specific couple of initiatives that the states, or the district in this case, is working on that they might need some help with research evidence. A focus on implementation and not just outcomes. Maybe this is because I spend too much time with economists, but they like to do outcome studies. They like to do these sort of either randomized controlled trial or causal analysis, which is great, and I love when we can do that kind of thing. But I view them, and I've heard these referred to as autopsies, right? Like you get to the end and then you find out why the patient died. And I would much rather couple that with something that might help me cure the patient beforehand, even if maybe it messes up the causal analysis. Like I'm okay with that, because I feel like my job is to help the state implement the most effective policy that it can. And I need to know how implementation is going in order to do that. Another piece that's really helpful is to facilitate comparisons. I think human beings are really, they're naturally somewhat competitive, and so they want to be able to compare themselves to others. That's why when Ed Week comes out with quality counts every year, every state agency in the country is looking to see, well, did we get an A this year, and how do we do relative to Maryland, and those sorts of things. Similarly, I'm sure there's a war between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that you guys, every year, who's ahead on whatever measure. And so if researchers can produce reports that allow districts to compare themselves either to other districts or compare schools within the district, and not just school A versus school B, but give the actual names of the schools where possible, that makes a big difference to getting your research used. Another way to build on the lessons I've learned is to take some sort of national study and replicate it in a local context. Philadelphia is going to pay a lot more attention to if you replicated something along the lines of what they've done in the Measures of Effective Teaching study in Philadelphia, because it's more relevant to their context. All right, now we're going to get into the stuff that makes the researchers a little more uncomfortable. Draw actionable conclusions. My commissioner gets so frustrated when he gets a research project or report and it tells him something's wrong, but not why and not how he should fix it. And, he's capable of weighing that recommendation in with his own professional judgment, in with evidence from other studies. But he really appreciates it when researchers take that step to say, what should you do on the basis of this evidence? And particularly when you have either a large-scale study or you're doing something like a lit review that covers, a broad range. The word should, I think, is an important word when you're trying to get the attention of a policymaker. Please, dear Lord, stop writing tomes. I don't want to read it. You don't want to write it. It's really it's serving no purpose. So one of the things we did in our statewide study of educator evaluation is we don't have any big final reports in this project. We've done a lot of really quick turnaround, like do a survey in April and get early results to us a few weeks later, and a final report maybe a little later on when you've had time to triple check. Get out in the field and interview people, and then give us early findings within a few weeks, and then write up the report later. Turn your research rubric. So we've got researchers who've done they've looked at a bunch of evaluation files pre and post implementation to see are people implementing with fidelity. Turn the rubric that you use to do your research into a tool for the state. That's what we're going to try to do this. We'll see how it goes. It might be back next year, I'll let you know. But that kind of thing is much, much more helpful than the giant report that just sits there and collects dust. I had a different project I worked on where we did the giant report, and we ended up basically every year that report would come out about 6 months after the school year had ended. So we're already into the next school year, and so far into the school year that it had no hope of influencing the program for that year because they were off to the races. And we ended up with this kind of zombie program where we knew it wasn't working, but we never had the evidence quite in time to do anything differently. And it's because we did the tome. If we'd done the quicker turnaround stuff, we would have known and been able to fix it. My last suggestion is to embrace imperfect information. And this might be the hardest of all for researchers. So I want to illustrate this with a cartoon. For those of you who read XKCD, you may recognize this. The cartoon says, I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class, now I don't. The other person says, sounds like the class helped. Well, maybe. So my point here is to say that correlation is actually quite a useful thing. And so those of you who've read XKCD, you know that the best part's always the mouse over, right? Where like you look at the cartoon, and you put your mouse over it, and another little funny image or saying comes up. This is the part that I really want to emphasize. Correlation doesn't imply causation, but it does waggle its eyebrows suggestively and gesture furtively while mouthing, "Look over there." And so I would like to end with a plea for more suggestive eyebrow waggling. So I think using correlation, and there are ways to do correlational analyses that clearly it's not a causal analysis, but where you can control for things, you try to adjust as best you can. That's really powerful, and most policy gets made on the basis of that kind of evidence. So finding a way to make that evidence as rigorous as you can, using the research tools in your bucket, I think will go a long way to having your research actually influence policy. Thank you very much.